Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Polytalks Environmental Politics. My name is Carson, and today we'll be covering the environmental implications of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, also abbreviated as ABBA. And for those of you unfamiliar with this bill, essentially it's a massive spending and budget policy that was passed by the Trump administration on Independence Day earlier this year. And it has numerous provisions ranging from cuts to SNAP and Medicaid, to increased spending for immigration enforcement, to an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, and what will be the subject of the video today, several major cuts to spending and tax incentives for clean energy and overall progress towards renewable development. And as we will cover today, this will have massive implications for the environmental movement in the United States and will certainly set us back relative to our goals and our climate projections for the years to come. So let's dive right into it. First of all, as you can see from this article, it's important to understand what exactly this bill does in relation to the climate. So there are two main provisions here that I want to highlight. First of all, the bill rolls back core electric vehicle and battery tax credits. So in case you don't remember from the Inflation Reduction Act episode I did a while back, the Biden administration essentially established a lot of consumer incentives in the form of tax credits and rebates that essentially incentivized electric vehicle adoption or solar energy projects on houses, etc. So both of these have been undermined by the Trump administration with this policy. So we have seen significant cuts to these rebates and tax credits, which, as you would expect, are going to disincentivize consumers to actually participate in electric vehicle progress or in solar energy projects. And that's going to, of course, lead to a shift of incentives and an overall irreparable harm to consumer incentives for renewable energy. And that will also put us back relative to China in the global electric vehicle market, which is significant because we are already behind, and this is only setting us further back. And the second main provision I want to highlight is that the bill's spending cuts target Inflation Reduction Act provisions primarily aimed at addressing climate risks. So this includes things like solar and wind energy, and essentially a lot of this spending is being cut, which is leading to a slowed pace of renewable development and overall less available funding and political capital for clean energy projects. So the one saving grace or silver lining of this bill, you could say, is that the bill actually in some ways incentivizes nuclear energy development, and this is certainly in line with the Trump administration's stance on nuclear energy, which was actually cemented through an executive order earlier this year in which President Trump essentially expanded incentives for nuclear energy adoption. And so the saving grace is that Trump does seem to be more committed to nuclear energy than his predecessors, but of course that does not outweigh the big dark cloud, which is these two cuts to electric vehicle subsidies and solar and wind projects. So what are the actual environmental implications of this? Well, first of all, we could see up to 310 million metric tons of additional carbon dioxide equivalent, so that's carbon dioxide or chemicals like methane when converted to their carbon dioxide equivalent, from the ABBA bill by the year 2035. And this is, of course, relative to the baseline scenario or the Biden administration, where the Inflation Reduction Act essentially established many climate-related incentives and programs that have now been slashed by the Big Beautiful Bill. And this number does seem bad in the abstract, but let's actually go ahead and contextualize it relative to its true impact on the climate for the next few decades. So this graph here does a pretty good job of showing how exactly Trump's policies are expected to diverge from the Paris Agreement climate pledge, which of course we are very far from meeting, as we have consistently exceeded our pledged emissions since the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement. But even still, we can see that Trump's policies are essentially causing the historical emissions to plateau. And plateauing is certainly not what we need right now in the urgent face of climate change and emissions. increasing worldwide. So this is important to keep in mind, and I think it's also important to compare that to the baseline scenario, which is the Biden administration. So as you can see by this graph, we have that same Paris Climate Agreement target in yellow here, and we have the same Trump target. And keep in mind, this is before the election, so things might have changed slightly, probably for the worse. But you can see that Biden's trajectory was certainly not in line with the target, but at the very least, it was less devastating. It decreased emissions more sharply, as you can see, and in the global fight against climate change, any marginal decrease in emissions will have positive impacts and is certainly better than the alternative. But you can see here that there is a massive differential between Biden's trajectory and Trump's trajectory. And what that suggests is simply that Trump is reversing a lot of the climate progress that was established in the Biden administration when the largest investment in climate technology was made in the history of this country. And this is only a signal of things to come. Keep in mind that Republicans do currently control all three houses of Congress, as well as the Supreme Court, and a large majority of state governors. So that does mean that we should expect even more cuts to federal climate incentives and renewable energy development in the years to come, which is certainly going to be an issue for climate change. So to conclude this video, I just want to explain how exactly this will affect U.S. climate policy in the decades to come, and what the civil sectors, so the public and states, individual states, can do to circumvent this. And I think there's a couple different layers of analysis here. I think the first thing to consider is simply that is on the federal level, the key consideration here is that progress simply will not be made until there is a fundamental shift in the administration. And a shift in the administration is not going to be achieved without electoral pressure. And so what I mean by that is that we have a midterm election in approximately a year from now. And what that midterm election is going to be is a referendum on Trump and his climate policies. At the very least, because obviously there's no scenario in which Democrats control all three houses of Congress in the distant future, but even in a better scenario, we could see that the Democrats might regain control over the House or Senate, which would effectively block any Trump climate policy at the door. So that would, at the very least, be like applying a tourniquet to the bleeding arm of U.S. climate policy. And so we could stop the radical cuts, but we could not exactly reverse the progress until there's a new administration. And then the second key layer of analysis is individual states. On the level of individual states, this is where, honestly, the vast majority of climate policy will have to come for the next few years. And so on the level of individual states, there are several things that states with sufficient political capital for climate incentives can do. So, for instance, one viable alternative is to establish a carbon market in between multiple states, which would effectively add carbon credits as a priced commodity in the market, which would kind of address the externality of pollution within the private sector. Now, there are a lot of issues with interstate carbon markets, regulation and transparency, as well as enforcement being one of them. But even still, it does remain a viable alternative for consolidating states' power and reducing emissions for the years to come, because that progress is certainly not coming from the federal administration. And beyond that, I think one of the best things the private sector can do to accelerate climate progress is simply to invest more in nuclear technology as well as new forms of solar technology. Keep in mind that ultimately the reason why fossil fuels remain predominant is because there is at the very least a perceived economic incentive to continuing fossil fuel use, and that we fear that the global transition to renewable energy will actually hamper profits. And I think the easy response to this is we are approaching a point where most forms of renewable energy are actually becoming cheaper than their dirty counterparts, and that means that it will soon become economically incentivized to switch over to those forms of economic power. And the way we can continue to ensure this transition is simply by establishing incentives through better technology that's more efficient, that's able to be cheaper, and that's going to be more attractive to investors and companies alike. So I think technological development and consistent state level pressure, as well as maintaining an impetus for federal shifts in administration going into the midterm elections, are all viable pathways to climate action. But certainly, the main conclusion of this episode is simply that climate progress will remain dire for the years to come, and it's by and large the fault of the Trump administration and their policies such as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which are reversing years of pre-established climate progress and restoring essentially the dominant role of fossil fuels within the United States. So I apologize that this has been a more serious and somber episode, and I hope that next time I'll have some better news to report. Carson, out.